Hello, and welcome to the Real American Revolution interview series with noted authors and historians to discuss what really happened during our war for independence. Now, my name is Randy Flood, and today I'll be talking with historian Mark Edward Lender about his best selling book, Cabal, The Plot Against George Washington. Now, this is the second in a series of interviews with Mark, and Mark was emeritus professor of history at Kean University in New Jersey and has written widely on early American military and social history. He's the author of The War for American Independence and co author of the award winning Citizen Soldier, the Revolutionary War Journal of Joseph Bloomfield. And he's also the author of Fatal Sunday, George Washington, the Monmouth Campaign, and the Politics of Battle, the latter of which was nominated for the 2017 George Washington Book Prize. So, Mark, welcome again to the Real American Revolution.
Thank you, Randy. It's nice to be back. I enjoyed myself the last time, and I'm looking forward to this.
Excellent. Well, let's set the background a little bit for our viewers and listeners. We know that cabal is defined in the dictionary as a number of persons secretly united for some private purposes, an intrigue or plot. So let's take a minute to set the stage for what led to the plot against General Washington. Now, the Continental Army was formed on June 14, 1775, in the aftermath of the battles between American colonists and British troops at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, in April of 1775. Congress selected George Washington of Virginia as commander in chief on June 15th, the day after the Continental Army was formed. 2 days later, from that, another significant battle took place on Breed's Hill, commonly referred to as Bunker Hill in Boston by most history books. Now, Washington had acquired considerable military combat experience in the French and Indian War, which preceded our American Revolution, so he appeared to be a logical choice. He assumed command of the colonial army of occupation, which surrounded the city of Boston until the British finally departed the city under siege in April of 1776. When Washington learned that the British would be returning, he moved south to defend New York City. And after losing multiple battles during the summer and fall of 1776, Washington and his army fled across New Jersey into Pennsylvania. Now, shortly thereafter, really, he gained two small victories at Trenton and Princeton, New Jersey in December 1776 and early January 1777, respectively, but then lost two major battles at Brandywine and Germantown, Pennsylvania, as the British occupied the Patriot capital of Philadelphia in the fall of 1777. Now, Mark, Washington appears to be on a losing streak, and Congress is not too happy. Why is that? What did Congress expect?
Well, they certainly didn't expect their general to start losing a war. And in 1770, or the fall of 1777, Washington's record stood in stark contrast to two separate things. And we need to keep both of them in mind to understand what was going on. First, he stood in contrast to his own earlier performance, 1777. He had rebuilt the Continental Army at Morristown over a difficult winter. And then that army came out fighting in the spring. The so-called forage campaign waged in northern and central New Jersey fought the British to its end, frustrated General William Howe, the British commander. They had to send thousands of redcoats out just to cover foraging operations. Washington's hit and run tactics were so successful. His Continentals learned to work with militia. They got combat experience. And you had politicians in the Continental Congress and elsewhere, patriot leaders elsewhere, who honestly believed that the war was moving into the home stretch, that the British could not continue to take the pounding they were taking, that tit for tat, a little bit here, a little bit there, was adding up. And they honestly expected 1777 would probably be the last year of the war that the British would pull out. The second thing is that you mentioned the losing streak for Washington. Yes, and we can talk about, well, his defeats are fairly well known, I'm sure, to most of our listeners, but the reverse at Brandywine, the loss of Philadelphia, the tragedy at Paoli, a major part of Washington's army under Anthony Wayne was surprised in a bayonet assault at night, then the failure of Washington's counterattack at Germantown. All of this stood in contrast not only to Washington's performance earlier in the year, but contemporaneously with the Philadelphia campaign, Horatio Gates was winning the Battle of Saratoga, forcing the surrender of an entire British army under John Burgoyne. So no matter how you look at it, and the Continental politicians and Patriot leadership, even in the States, were looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not a record that they liked. You hire generals to win, not lose a campaign, much less lose a war. And it became pretty, well, obvious to some of these folks that Washington was having a hard time standing his ground against the. That's not why you hire a general.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, there was. Uh, Congress reacted then, I think, as a Congress would react today
Mm-hmm.
if their commander in chief was obviously having a hard time in the field. They'd
Mm-hmm.
begin asking questions.
Well, Mark, let's talk about some of the specific critics. What were their specific arguments against the commander in chief?
There were really three, and we can break them down pretty succinctly. First of all, was Washington's record in the field. Those defeats stung. And it wasn't just the fact that Washington had been beaten, the engagements we mentioned at Brandywine, at Goli, at Germantown, the loss of Philadelphia. You not only lose prestige, you not only lose your striking power in your army or your defensive power, but you're losing the ability to recruit because morale sinks. You're losing your supplies and your munitions. It's not just the ammunition you shoot up; it's the ammunition that gets captured and the supplies that get captured when you pull out, and the enemy overruns your position or forces you to abandon a good deal of your supply base. So, just the record of military failure or the inability to hold off a British army, well, there's an argument right there, and I think everybody understood that as the basis of criticism of Washington. More than that, and this is the second thing we have to consider. Washington had based his military outlook on the creation of a regular American army, the Continental Line, as he called it, a respectable army, one that was raised for a year, as he had to do at Boston. But he wanted an army that could be trained, that would acquire veteran status and serve for a minimum of 3 years, but preferably enlistments would be, as they phrase it, war, meaning for the duration of the conflict. These are the kinds of units that gel, that have unit cohesion, that have standard training, know how to use arms and equipment, know how to prevail in times of difficulty, can bounce back from defeats, are going to be there when you need them, not necessarily like the militia. You have to call them up and hope they gather on time. A respectable army was what Washington wanted. This put him in a position with a fair number of Americans, not just those in the Continental, who bought into the militia ideal that free men can stand up and ultimately prevail over army, a standing army from Europe, which many Americans simply saw as mercenaries. They were not. They were not. It was a jolt to a lot of Americans to find that a lot of the redcoats took the cause of the king seriously as they took the cause of the revolution. Nevertheless, Republican ideology, the ideology that was the prevalent political outlook for most of the American, not just rebels, but for the loyalists. They put a great deal of stock in the militia tradition, the militia ideal. Citizen soldiers will get out there and they will prevail. And look, you mentioned in your introduction, you have the examples of Concord, Bunker Hill. These were the people who came out, swarmed out of the countryside, right out of Republican ideology, exactly what Republican ideologues expected would happen. And look at the result. Lexington and Concord, huge embarrassment. The siege of Boston, the British had to quit. Yes, tactically they won at Bunker Hill, but at a catastrophic course. British commanders never wanted another. That time in British military history, in North America, their losses in proportion to those engaged, their losses at Bunker Hill, worst beating they'd ever absorbed. So why not fight with militia? Uh, uh, Seemingly was proven in the field. So there were those who held Washington's insistence on creating a professional army against him. And these were not necessarily marginal voices. You had some pretty important people who believed it. And the third thing, again, almost combines the first two. This was Horatio. Gates was not a lightweight. He had a combat record. He was at Monongahela with Washington in Braddock's defeat. He also had very, very valuable military administrative skills that the Army needed. He was a viable candidate should the commander-in-chief fail, but he also seemed to have the magic touch. Yes, he understood the value of Continental regulars, but militia seemed to like the man, and there were reasons for that. I mean, Gates did his best to try to get the militia properly equipped and organized. He did his best to see that paid promptly. This was a man who seemed to have the common touch. Now, I'm not going to get into the argument of whether or not Gates really had all of that, but at the time, popular perception was that here was a man who could win battles, but he could also rally militia. So on those two counts, he could be a winner in the field, and he could do it using militia. This made him appealing to a lot of Americans who had begun to lose faith in, or at least to question, Washington's ability to win the war. Mm-hmm. I should point out, Congress was aware of what military history had taught during the 7 years' war, the French and Indian War. They knew darn well that William Pitt, British Prime Minister for most of the French and Indian War, did not tolerate losing generals. One after another, after the death of Braddock and Monongahela, British commanders-in-chief in North America were fired when they did not produce satisfactory military and political results. Went on through till the appointment of Jeffrey Amherst, who turned out to be a war winner. But even when Amherst went home, he found himself criticized for failing to make peace with the Indians and for failing to produce some of the political results that that Parliament was looking for. So it was traditional, really, and the French and Indian experience was the American colonial experience on the floor of the Continental Congress. William Pitt's attitude toward losing generals was a and well, it should have been. I mean, what do you do when your general is not winning? Having said all of that, and this is important, I want to dispense with this good guys, bad guys dichotomy when we consider Washington's critics and Washington's defenders. They were all patriots. Washington's most astringent critics did not want to lose that war. They were critics because they wanted to win the war. They didn't necessarily object to Washington on a personal basis. They had ideological and practical differences with him. But let's look at a couple of examples. One of the most critical members of the Patriot Pantheon was Samuel Adams, a genuine hero of the Revolutionary War, but did not George Washington, in chief. Yet his son, Sam Adams Jr., was an Army doctor serving in Washington's Army who served valiantly, as a matter of fact, very close to the line. I tracked his conduct at the Battle of Monmouth, and he was heroic. Then you have James Lovell of Massachusetts, maybe the most fiery ideologue in Congress, one of the most longest serving members of Congress. While he is excoriating Washington's performance, his son is a Continental officer, wounded in combat, served as an infantry officer, and then ended up in the mounted troops. Served throughout the war with distinction. James Lovell didn't want to lose the war, and he had his son in there. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence. Brilliant man, but a blabbermouth of major proportions. Yet, served as an army doctor, did his very, very best to create medical conditions that or to correct medical. I mean, this simply appalled him because the Continentals, as in most armies of the day, would lose more men to disease than to combat.
Mm-hmm.
Rush knew this, and he stayed close to the situation, and frankly, risking disease and the tribulations of camp life himself at various times. So we can't fault the patriotism of Washington's critics.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like, that's a pretty important point.
Excellent, excellent. That's fascinating. Well, Mark, who was actually behind the cabal, the plot, and who was Conway?
Poor Thomas Conway is probably is involved in all of this, but he was not one of the main drivers. He tried to be a beneficiary of it, but let's do a little biographical background on Thomas Conway. He was an Irish-born soldier whose parents took him to France at an early age. So he was bilingual, which made him popular in America. He was a French officer who came over, and most of the French officers did not speak English. He did, so he could fit in. He was popular. He was a French colonel, and he admitted that he came to America hoping to burnish his resume so he could get a promotion when he went back to France. Congress liked him. John Adams was very impressed with Conway. Washington thought well of Conway. Congress made him a brigadier general, and Washington gave him a brigade. Now, which is a collection of several regiments. He was a competent brigade commander. And his problem was he couldn't keep his mouth shut either. He considered that he was a better brigadier than most of the American brigadiers, and considered that he should be given a whole division as a major general. And he was importuning Congress, importuning Washington for that promotion. He was the junior brigadier general in the Continental Army, and he wanted to be jumped over the other brigadiers who were, I'm looking for a professional phrase, went ballistic at this guy. It really was a problem for Washington, who simply wanted Conway to stop this. And he wanted Congress to stop listening to the man. He tried to impress on Congress how disturbed the rest of the Army was about this man importuning promotion. But he was a competent brigade commander. We need to keep that in mind. Now, who else was involved, and how does Conway come back into the loop? You had members of Congress, as we've discussed, who were not happy with Washington's performance. John Adams, Sam Adams, James Lovell, Jonathan Dickinson Sargent. These were some of the more radical members of Congress, those who believed in much of the militia ideology, had some issues with Washington demanding that, or insisting that Washington was too much of a politician and Congress do something. He could be insistent in pressing his view, and Congress did give him his respectable army, allowed him to start building it. It didn't mean everybody was happy about it. So when Washington was having difficulties in the field, and Gates was obviously doing a lot better up north, there were those who said, wait a minute, we've got a winner, and we have a guy who's having a difficult time here. You had a reorganization in Congress of a group called the Board of War. And now we get to the heart of this. The Board of War was created in 1776. Congress had been trying to run the war as sort of a committee of the whole. They agreed, we can't do this. There's too much else going on. There's diplomacy, dealing with 13 individual states. There's Indian relationships. There's financial stuff going on. There's appointments to be made in different offices and so forth. How can we run a war and do all this? They created the Board of War, and they took selected delegates and said, "You will be the board of war." The membership changed, but it was generally about 5 members. And that went on for a year. But the same problem was there. These men were delegates, and their attention was drawn back to the broader picture of waging a revolution. John Adams was president of the Board of War while a member of Congress. He said he never worked harder in his life because he was doing double duty. In October of 1777, Congress agreed that it couldn't go on the way it was, and they reorganized the Board of War. It reported to Congress, was tasked with the administrative aspects, routine correspondence, taking care of equipment that wasn't being used, managing British prisoners of war, taking this, the goal was to take this off of Washington. That had been the original intent of the Board of War. Now they thought they were going to do it by having the Board of War composed not of members of Congress, but by outsiders, military expertise, who would focus on military affairs, not running the army, not being involved in the day-to-day operations of the army, but taking care of these routine administrative tasks. The commander-in-chief wrote himself affairs in the field. The man who served as the chief consultant for Congress as they reorganized was Thomas Mifflin of Pennsylvania. Mifflin had been post aide of Washington. He was serving at the time as quartermaster general of the army. He was a major general, but he fell out with Washington. He fell out in late 1776, disappointed in Washington's performance, particularly the loss of Fort Washington. Really, Mifflin greatly resented the rise of Nathaniel Greene as an aide and confidant of Washington. As Greene's influence grew, Thomas Mifflin's influence declined. There was without getting into the Greene-Mifflin controversy, the two men did not like each other. And as Greene became more influential, not just with Washington, but with the Army generally, Mifflin took great offense. Yet Mifflin had influence in Congress, particularly when the seat of war was in Pennsylvania, because Mifflin was a prominent Pennsylvania political, an early revolutionary, an ardent patriot, by the way. But now he had lost influence with Washington and he was losing faith. When he organized the Board of War for Congress, Congress listened to him as they organized it. It was Mifflin who, and this is right in the records of the Congress, the Journal of the Continental Army. Mifflin suggested that Horatio Gates, the victor at Saratoga, and also, as we will see, a man who had become skeptical of Washington's leadership and thought perhaps more than he ought to of his own leadership. Mifflin arranged for Congress to appoint Horatio Gates president of the Board of War. Technically, he became Washington's boss because the commander-in-chief was supposed to report through the Board of War. This was something that Washington's inner circle found very disturbing. And there was reason, because even before Gates left the field, York, Pennsylvania, that's where Congress was sitting after they'd evacuated Philadelphia. Mifflin had persuaded Congress to appoint an inspector general of the Army. Washington had wanted an inspector general. He wanted someone to institute a uniform drill, a uniform training program, uniform methods of officer evaluations. This was an important staff position that Washington envisioned as one of his right-hand men, a man reporting directly to him with the rank of Major General. That's not how it worked out. Under Mifflin's recommendation, Congress passed legislation making the Inspector General reporting directly, not as Commander-in-Chief, but the Board of War. And it gave the powers I just mentioned, training, evaluations, to the Inspector General, and they named, again, with Mifflin's recommendation, Thomas Conway as Inspector General and promoted him to Major. Washington was appalled. The rest of the Army was generally appalled. So right away, the new Board of War and the Commander-in-Chief are off to a very, very rocky start. Now, there's not time to go into Washington's relationship with Thomas Conway, other than to say Washington froze him out. He showed up at Valley Forge, and Washington was civil at best, maybe not even that. There were officers who wouldn't even. After a week or so, Conway gave it up, went back to York to complain to the Board of War and to Congress, and Congress didn't know what to do, to tell you the truth. And they dealt with it as many politicians will deal with delicate situations. They dealt with it by not dealing with it, did nothing, and the situation simmered. It was into this void in February of 1777 that Friedrich Steuben came on the scene, and we all know what happened from that point on. Ultimately, he got the job. Conway lost his title as Inspector General, but he kept his promotion to Major General. He would be a pain in the neck to Washington in various other ways, but in effect, when Washington was able to get Steuben, he got the staff officer that he wanted. Congress ultimately relented on that because and we've all known how touchy Washington was about maintaining military subordination to civilian authority. But here was Washington cutting it pretty close to the edge. And his civilian superiors have said, this is your Inspector General. This is who he's going to report to. And Washington, so this was a touchy thing. Now, when Gates became president of the Board of War, he in effect took two more operations from Washington. He wanted to run his own quartermaster operation. He wanted to run his own commissary operation. The quartermaster general is an absolutely critical. He's got to move the army. He's got to make sure that things get where they're supposed to be. It's the quartermaster general who lays out lines of march. It's the commissary general who purchases and distributes supplies of various types. These are critical officers. Gates began to operate his own commissary operation and actually had the Board of War received legislation from Congress specifically forbidding the established Army commissary operation from meddling with Gates's new one. Now imagine this. Army is struggling to survive at Valley Forge. You have the established commissary department run by a man who was not particularly efficient. Even Washington wanted him out. Washington wanted his name his own. But his agents are out there trying to purchase supplies for the Army. At the same time, Gates sends out a new outfit. They were called superintendents, not purchasing agents. They are competing for the same supplies as the commissary. It gets better because or worse, obviously, because the Army is in Pennsylvania at the time, and the state of Pennsylvania, in good faith, trying to help out, sends its supply agents out into the countryside, competing for exactly the same supplies. You had three different acquisition groups out there, and wondering how the prices shot up, the confusion of who was in charge of commissary operations. It was, you can't imagine a bigger violation of the concept of unity of command at a time when the Army desperately needed clear lines of authority. Same thing with the quartermaster. It was a recommendation of Thomas Mifflin, and Congress bought it. A relatively weak quartermaster. The quartermaster operations were subdivided at least four ways, and none of these people were to report directly to the commander-in-chief. Washington was beside himself. It was, I'll use the term administrative coup. You had the Board of War now trying to overstep its bounds of just a support group, now wanting to become directly involved in daily Army operations. This is not why the board was created. And
Mhm.
Gates was operating in good faith. He believed he was doing the right thing. He wasn't.
Mhm.
And Washington's staff and chief took umbrage at all of this, not only because of the usurpation of Washington's authority, but because without that authority, the job wasn't getting done.
Mhm.
Washington simply did not have people under his authority, and the people who were there uh, didn't have the commander in chief's faith at all.
Mhm.
Ultimately, Congress had to back off on this too, but only after Congress sent to camp 5 of its members called the Committee at Camp, sent them from York to work directly with Washington on what was clearly everybody would now understood was a real crisis.
Mhm.
Washington became very close with this group and ultimately got them on his side to deal with the Board of War and Congress generally,
Mhm.
and to send reports back saying that we need an inspector general. Steuben came
Mhm.
perfectly to fit the job. That the commissary operation Gates has planned, it's that the recommendation for the restructured quartermaster operation was absurd. Not
Mhm.
to give these positions to make. He did. This is the point at which Washington gets Nathaniel Greene to accept the quartermaster generalship and Jeremiah Wadsworth to become commissary general. Both competent individuals, um, both appointed with the approval of the committee at camp. Now Congress is beginning to recognize that the authority that had been chipping away from Washington was not going into hands that were going to do any
Mhm.
got worse. Is it possible to get worse? Yes, a lot. Gates began to become directly involved in Army operations. He created new artillery units, which specifically were not under the command of Washington's Chief of Artillery, Henry Knox. Knox, I found some correspondence from Knox to Washington. It was very plaintive. What is Gates doing? What's going on here? Gates began to move infantry units around without checking. And there were other little things where Thomas Conway comes back into play. Begins to contravene orders Washington issued because he said he's got authority of the Board of War to do it. This was a mess. Mission creep is a term we use today that they did not
Right.
use in the 18th. In business, they call it scope today, but the Army actually has a formal definition of mission creep. That's when a unit or organization uh, attempts to extend its authority beyond its original intent.
Mhm.
And that's what we had. Now, there's 2 kinds of mission creep. A lot of it handled is, it's innocent. There's an organization created to do one thing, but there's something over here we can take care of too, and they began to operate in that area. There's another kind, and let's call it a power grab, and that's what we had going. I call it an administrative coup because uh, the Board of War was acting legally. Congress was acting legally, and everybody knew that the measures that they were undertaking at the expense of Washington's command authority.
Mm.
John Henry Lawrence, president of the Continental Congress, saw it. He warned his son, John Lawrence, who was a staff member on Washington's inner circle. You had other um, members of Congress. The light bulb began to come on, and the final straw, the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Um, some cliches do make sense. Uh, was the so-called eruption into Canada, where Horatio Gates and the Board of War decided in February of 1777 to invade Canada. How they intended to do this, Lord only knows. The Army is barely surviving at Valley Forge, where they were going to get the men, where they were going to get the munitions and materiel, transport. much less the money to stage a new invasion of Canada, Lord only knows. I mean, he had a rationale. Gates had a rationale. It didn't work in 1775. Let's try it again. He had intelligence, incorrect as it turned out, that British ability to defend Canada was probably minimal. That was not the case. If they had been invaded, they could have dealt with it. But then, not only was the idea far-fetched, what Gates did was come up with the entire plan and issue orders to implement. Never checked in with Washington as the plan came together, never checked in with the commander-in-chief. They issued orders. The whole invasion was to be run through the Board of War, not through the commander-in-chief. And without telling Washington, he appointed Lafayette as commander of this invading army headed to Canada. Now, that actually made sense. There were a lot of French-speaking Canadians up there, and Lafayette would carry the banner of France north. That made sense, but Lafayette was having none of it. And he was still a kid. He had direct orders to march immediately to Albany and there take charge of organizing this invasion. With Washington's full approval, he did not. He marched to York, Pennsylvania, to query the Board of War as to what on earth it was doing, insisting that if this was going to happen at all, it was going to happen as an extension of Washington's command. Didn't want anything to do with something commanded by the Board of War. If anyone else had done this, Congress would have simply probably fired him. But this is Lafayette. He is a key to the French alliance. There's no way they can tell him no. Henry Lawrence, who thought the entire idea of the eruption into Canada was ridiculous from the beginning, thought this was hilarious. You can read his letters to his son, saying how they didn't know what to do with this kid Lafayette. I mean, we can't slap him down, but he's too well connected. One of the best stories to come out of this is at a dinner given by the Board of War, probably at Gates's headquarters. Lafayette proposes a toast to Washington, the commander. And there are embarrassed looks all around, and they are forced to drink it. But it was noted at the time that there were a lot of people who were just sort of swallowing pretty hard as Lafayette confronted them with this. And it was at this juncture that everybody finally understood that things had gone too far. The eruption into Canada, if you want to mark a formal end to the cabal or this administrative coup, as I've called it, probably that was it. And there is some hard evidence to support it. You look at French diplomatic correspondence. Girard, didn't have the title of ambassador yet, but he was the representative of the French court, reporting back to Vergennes, the French foreign minister, saying point blank that this whole eruption into Canada was part of, he used the term, the cabal against Washington. Mm-hmm. More important, a letter from Joseph Reed. Reed was another important Pennsylvanian, member of the Continental Congress, a member of the committee at Camp, and a former aide to Washington who had again been critical of Washington. He was part of pretty nasty correspondence in late 1776 between himself and General Lee, critical of Washington's leadership. Washington became aware of it, but he was busy at the time, pressed the matter. But now Reed is in the committee at Camp, and he looks at the eruption into Canada and concludes that it is a part of a long series of measures, and we can date it from the controversy over the inspector generalship right on down to the commissary generalship, through the quartermaster generalship, some of these other little irritations. And he wrote a letter to another member of Congress who was not at the committee, still in New York, And it's just a classic piece of correspondence saying, how on earth can we task an individual with such important duties? As he put, we place such authority and duties in hands, and yet pass a series of measures to compromise. And
Mm-hmm.
it's time to make a decision. Back the man or get rid of him. Time to back.
Mm-hmm.
I think that pretty much sums up how Congress came to feel about all.
Mm-hmm.
An awful lot of red faces, again, with tongue in cheek. Henry Lawrence writing to his son saying, eruption into Canada? What eruption? And everybody just, what was that all about?
Yeah.
But the most important thing, I think, was the Reed letter. That
Mm-hmm.
it's time to either uh, uh, get rid of Washington or keep him.
Mm-hmm.
And it was time to keep him. Stop all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And get down to business with
Mm-hmm.
the personnel Washington needs and restore the authority Washington needs.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't over. It took the Monmouth campaign to really put the nail in the coffin of Washington's critics.
Mm-hmm.
But by that time, Washington had proven his point that, first of all, he wasn't going to roll over in the face of all this. He believed he was the man for
Mm-hmm.
it. It wasn't just pride. He honestly believed he was the man for the job.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, with Mark, with all the plotting, actually behind his back and in front of him, Washington also had an awful lot on his plate. But let's drill down a little bit. How did he actually fight back? Did he have any defenders there that
he
were?
sure did. He sure did.
Talk to us about that.
I think this is one of the differences between a commander in chief and a mere general. Commander in chief has got to have political skill. He's got to be able to manage difficult personalities. He's got to be able to take the big picture. Come up with a modern comparison. I think Dwight Eisenhower as commander in the European theater of operations could get Omar Bradley and Patton and Bernard Montgomery talking and keep them all on the same team. Not easy. But Washington had this ability. And he had the ability to understand when you can take a stand with politicians and when you need to give. And you got to pick your battles. And Washington could do it. He stonewalled on the inspector generalship. He went out of his way to deal, well, kindly is but professionally with the committee at camp until he could bring them around. He presented them with a plan of action. So he was smart enough to know there's an old political thing, whoever sets the agenda wins. Washington set the agenda with the committee at camp and gave them a very detailed, this is what we need to do, soup to nuts, probably written by Alexander Hamilton in draft, but using Washington's ideas. So he was smart enough to do that. Then he was also smart enough to take advantage of the staff that he had around him. Hamilton was also a kid too, as young as Lafayette. John Lawrence, the son of the president of the Continental Congress, also very, very young. They were connected. And Washington had other staff members as well. Some of them older, more seasoned in dealing with colonial politics. They wrote letters. They wrote to governors. They dealt with William Livingston in New Jersey, George Clinton in New York. There was no governor. There was a president of the Executive Council in Pennsylvania, but they got to these people and said, look, this is what Washington's trying to do. These are the people standing in his way. We've got to rally around the commander in chief. Washington was smart enough not to write letters like this himself. He was the commander in chief. He was going to rise above this and try to manage the situation, an active political combatant. He had his people do that. And that was exactly what a good political combatant does. If you can appear to be above the fray, everybody knew Washington was furious, but he was too good to show his hand. He had Hamilton show his hand. Had Hamilton writing some wonderful letters to political leaders. John Lawrence kept his father in Congress fully abreast of what was going on. Henry Lawrence returned the compliment so that the political atmosphere in York was no surprise to Washington's people at Valley Forge. You had other members of his staff. Finch Tillman of Maryland actually tried to get a letter writing campaign going to damn Conway and Gates and Mifflin to drum up support. Actually got people to write to Benjamin Franklin, then on diplomatic in Paris, and informing him that Washington, we need to stand by Washington. So this was a very sophisticated response, and Washington was smart enough to allow very, very good people. Washington had a knack for picking good people. Now, having said that, you say, what about Benedict Arnold? Okay, not everybody's perfect, but he made some mistakes, obviously. But in general, he picked very, very good people to have close to him. They were absolutely loyal to Washington. Of all the people on Washington's immediate staff, there wasn't a single one who jumped ship during the time Washington was under heavy political fire. Instead, they rallied around. I would say, all in all, if you take all the critics of Washington and pile them all up, Washington was a better politician than all of them put together.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, again, he's a commander-in-chief. If he doesn't have these skills, he's going to go. And there's a point to be made there, too. If you were a commander-in-chief and you didn't have them, the Continental Congress got rid of you, and they did. There was another commander-in-chief. Essex Hopkins was commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy. Did not produce political and military results that Congress found satisfactory. He had virtually no political skills, and they got rid of him. They got rid of him. So they could do it if they wanted to, but Washington knew how to deal with it. Hopkins didn't.
Well, a lot of this, Mark, is like a political intrigue in the middle of a war. So was there actually a conspiracy against Washington, or is it just political hyperbole and intrigue that's evolving against Washington?
Depending on how you define a conspiracy. Did they sit around and plot? They didn't have to. They were the Continental Congress, and they operated very openly. They knew what they were doing. Why sit around and plot when you already control the legislative mechanism of the revolution? You didn't have to plot. Washington's supporters, tried to characterize their actions in the worst possible way. There's no question about that. Hamilton, a brilliant mind, but a wonderful hater. Oh, Lord, his correspondence dealing with Horatio Gates and Thomas Mifflin, Thomas Conway was absolutely venomous. I mean, and you had others who looked at it in the same way. So did they sit around and get rid of Washington? They didn't have to do that. Administratively, they were in control already. If anything, that made it even more dangerous for Washington. These were the legal representatives of the 13 different colonies. If he lost their support, it was worse than a conspiracy, because if a conspiracy was uncovered, something underhanded, genuine skullduggery, you could point to it and say, look, we're in the middle of a war. How can you people act like this? This is ridiculous. No, these were people who were trying to win the war, trying to implement policies to deal with a situation where they thought the war was being lost. So if you want to call that a conspiracy, sure there was. You want to call it a plot, as my publisher wanted to call it? You bet.
Yeah.
You bet. But it was, I prefer administrative coup. They were in charge. They could do administratively what they felt best the situation called for. And as you go through the record, as I hope I made clear in the book, that's exactly what they did.
Mhm.
That's exactly what they did.
Interesting. Well, for a long time, historians even questioned the existence of the Conway Cabal, referencing politics as usual, that type of thing. What changed your mind about
Well,
this?
yeah, that's a good question. And then, well, okay, well, if it hadn't changed my mind, there wouldn't have been a book. Uh, for a long time, the first generation, several generations of American historians had certainly believed that Washington had a threat. Then it came down to a book published by Bernard Nolenberg, Washington and the Revolution, 1940-41. And he was a lawyer, and he looked at it like an attorney. Is there a case really here for a plot against Washington, a conspiracy, something illegal, something underhanded? And he said, I can't find it. And from that point on, most academic historians bought into it. Outside of academia, different story. The popular line generally was that there was a conspiracy against Washington, something underhanded. Um, this second book, Cabal, grew out of a book you and I discussed some time back, Fatal Sunday, Washington and the Monmouth Campaign, where I looked at it and I noticed all the buzz around Washington's performance, a lot of it negative. And I also noticed how when Washington came out of the Monmouth campaign, he was able to put all that to rest. So I said, what happened? Was this threat to Washington more severe than other historians might have thought? And I just simply went back to the sources and forgot which historian said it several generations ago. You've got to go to the sources. And I had the opportunity to go to sources that simply weren't available to historians for a long, long time. The letters of delegates of the Continental Congress was absolutely a treasure trove on the Cabal. And these were men were writing letters to and from constituents back home, writing letters to and from themselves, where they talked about this. I mean, it wasn't. I'm sure that they did more talking than they did writing, but they did a lot of writing. And this was a matter of discussion. And Washington's critics were very open about it. They knew what they were trying to accomplish, and whether or not it was the actual removal of Washington, or more a matter of taking charge of the war effort, putting it in the hands of Gates and the Board of War. And it's there in those letters of delegates. Now, those letters existed before I was able to work on this project, but they were not all in one place, and they weren't, or most of them were scattered in archives all over the place, which would have been years of research. The Papers of George Washington Project brought together correspondence to and from the general that was extremely revealing on all of this. And again, luckily, it's an ongoing project, but luckily for me, that the period under consideration is already done. Editing was completed, and I had access to that. You had the papers of William Livingston, the governor of New Jersey, got pulled together, published in 5 volumes. And there's the internet with sources online that could have been dug out, but it would have taken so much time to do it. And you might not have got it because a lot of these sources on the internet are now searchable. Well, if you plug in the word Conway, for example, all kinds of stuff comes up. I looked at the old works on all of this, and most of the stuff just wasn't cited. Not that it wasn't out there, but it wasn't available to scholars. And this is true of any number of manuscript collections. David Locke on now, but there was the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond. It was the Emmett Collection in New York Public Library. This is one of the benefits of modern technology really being meshed with traditional research,
Hmm.
which is, and I was able to take advantage of it. And I'm very fortunate in that. It was an advantage that any previous historians simply didn't have.
Hmm. Wow. Well, as we wrap up, what's the one thing that a reader should take away from Cabal?
That the criticisms of Washington were deeper and more serious than most of us had realized. That the threat to his command authority was quite genuine. Whether or not he would have remained in command if he was faced with an inspector general that he didn't want, or that he was forced to deal with commissary and quartermaster operations that he didn't want, whether or not he would have remained in command if in his position if he was forced to deal with Horatio Gates as a boss running actual military operations. That's anybody's guess. My guess is that he would not have, that he would have seen it as a futile exercise and perhaps gone home. Even if he had stayed, he'd have just been another mere general. So we've got to understand the serious takeaway is that Washington was under serious threat in what it's a 19th century term. Nobody called it the Conway Cabal. And I think it's also important to remember that Washington's critics were as patriotic as George Washington was. This was not over some animosity against Washington, not uh, an effort to remove him or reduce his command authority because of personal differences with him. But it was about patriots seeking the best route to winning a very, very difficult war. And it's not good guys against bad guys. Honest disagreement among patriots as to how to proceed against very, very efficient British Army.
Hmm. Wow. Terrific. Well, Mark, thanks so much for joining me again. It's been really educational and certainly enlightening. I learned
well,
something every time I talk with you. So thank you again for being with us.
well,
Okay.
thank you for having me, Larry. I genuinely appreciate it. It was fun, and perhaps we can do this again.
Absolutely. Well, to our listeners and viewers, we've been talking with historian Mark Edward Linder, author of Cabal, The Plot Against George Washington, available on Amazon and other book outlets. Join us again when the Real American Revolution brings you another in an exciting series of interviews that helps us to better understand what really happened during our war for independence. My name is Randy Flood, and so long for now.